February 23, 1945. 6 Marines struggle up the slope of Mount Suribachi. The wind snaps a small American flag as it rises against a gray sky. A photographer captures the moment. In seconds, it becomes one of the most famous images in American history. The photograph, taken by Joe Rosenthal, would define the Battle of Iwo Jima in the public mind. Strength, unity, triumph. But that image froze a single moment in a battle that was far from over. Because when that flag went up, thousands of Marines were still pinned down across the island. And thousands more would die after the photograph was taken. Iwo Jima was not a clean victory. It was not a swift breakthrough. It was a month-long grind through volcanic ash, concrete bunkers, and a labyrinth of tunnels carved beneath the earth. On February 19th, 4 days before the flag raising, the first waves of U.S. Marines landed on black sand beaches under the command of General Holland Smith and Major General Harry Schmidt. They expected fierce resistance at the shoreline. They were met with silence, no immediate barrage, no obvious defensive line. The beach looked empty. That silence was intentional. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the Japanese garrison, had abandoned traditional beach defenses. He ordered his men to hold fire until the beaches were crowded with men and equipment. He had redesigned the island into a fortress. Nearly 21,000 Japanese defenders were dug into reinforced bunkers, hidden artillery positions, and more than 11 miles of interconnected tunnels. They would not attempt banzai charges. They would not waste themselves in early assaults. They would make every yard cost blood. When the firing finally began, it came from everywhere at once. Artillery from concealed positions, machine guns from concrete embrasures, mortar from underground chambers. The black volcanic sand swallowed vehicles. Marines struggled to move. Digging foxholes was nearly impossible. The terrain offered no cover. The beach became a trap. And Mount Suribachi, the volcano at the southern end of the island, loomed over it all. By the time the flag went up on its summit, nearly 1,000 Americans were already dead. But the photograph did not show the tunnels. It did not show the flamethrowers clearing bunkers. It did not show the men fighting in darkness beneath the surface. It showed a moment of elevation, not the reality beneath it. The battle behind the flag was still unfolding, and it would become one of the bloodiest fights in Marine Corps' history. War never changes. It just hides its cost behind the symbols we choose to remember. The silence on the beach did not last. When the Japanese opened fire on February 19, 1945, it was not chaotic. It was disciplined. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had forbidden mass suicide charges. He rejected the idea of dying gloriously on the shoreline. Instead, he built depth, defense in layers. Under Iwo Jima's surface, engineers and soldiers carved an underground fortress. More than 11 miles of tunnels connected artillery positions, machine gun nests, supply rooms, and command posts. Bunkers were reinforced with concrete and steel. Many were hidden so well that naval bombardment barely scratched them. American battleships had shelled the island for days before the landing. It wasn't enough. When Marines advanced inland from the beaches, they found no continuous trench line to break. Instead, resistance appeared in fragments. A machine gun here, mortar fire there, and then disappeared. Bunkers that had been cleared reopened from behind. Flamethrower teams were deployed repeatedly. Demolition charges sealed entrances, only for defenders to reappear through secondary exits. The island was fighting back from underground. Movement was measured in yards, sometimes in feet. Mount Suribachi was isolated and assaulted by the 28th Marines. After brutal close combat, it was secured on February 23rd. The flag raising followed. But north of Suribachi, The hardest fighting was just beginning. The terrain shifted into ridges and defensive strongpoints, names that would become synonymous with attrition. Motoyama Airfield, Hill 382, the meat grinder. The Japanese did not need to counterattack in waves. They needed to survive long enough to kill. Every bunker became a miniature siege. Every advance required combined arms, infantry, tanks, engineers, naval gunfire, close air support. Even then, progress was slow. The cost rose daily. Casualties mounted faster than anticipated. Units rotated through the line exhausted, shaken, burned by flamethrower backblasts and concussion from point-blank explosions. And still, the defenders held. Kuribayashi's strategy was simple: make the Americans bleed so heavily that future invasions of the Japanese home islands would seem unbearable. It was not about winning Iwo Jima. It was about shaping what came next. By the end of the first week, the Marines understood something the photograph did not show. Taking Suribachi was symbolic. Taking the island would be something else entirely. The deeper they pushed north, the stronger the resistance became, and the island had no intention of surrendering quickly. By early March 1945, Iwo Jima had become something else entirely. Not an invasion, not a maneuver battle, a siege in open air. The northern sector of the island, a maze of ridges and fortified hills, absorbed men the way the black sand had absorbed vehicles on day one. Hill 382, Turkey Knob, the amphitheater. Marines nicknamed the central defensive complex the meat grinder, because that's what it was. Every position had to be reduced one at a time. Tanks advanced only to be hit by concealed anti-tank guns firing from camouflaged embrasures. Infantry moved forward behind flamethrowers. Demolitions teams crawling within yards of bunker openings before detonating charges. And even then, the fight rarely ended. Japanese defenders would seal blast doors internally, move through tunnels, and re-emerge behind advancing units. Areas declared secured erupted again hours later. There were no clean breakthroughs, just attrition. By mid-battle, American casualties exceeded early estimates dramatically. The Marines had expected heavy losses. They had not expected this scale of sustained resistance. Nearly every Japanese defender had orders not to surrender. Kuribayashi prohibited mass banzai charges because he understood they wasted manpower. Instead, his men fought until ammunition was gone. Then they fought with grenades. Then with rifles used as clubs. Some fought from tunnels until suffocation. The Americans held overwhelming superiority in naval gunfire and air support. But against reinforced subterranean networks, bombardment alone could not finish the job. The most brutal fighting occurred after the flag had already been raised. That is the part rarely remembered. On March 16th, U.S. commanders declared the island secured. It wasn't entirely true. Isolated resistance continued for days. On the night of March 25th, Japanese soldiers launched a final coordinated attack near the airfields, killing and wounding dozens before being eliminated. By the time organized resistance ended, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead. Over 19,000 were wounded. Of roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, only about 200 were captured alive. It was one of the only Pacific battles where American casualties exceeded total Japanese survivors. The flag on Suribachi had suggested momentum. The reality was exhaustion. Victory, yes, but earned in inches, and paid for in thousands of lives long after the photograph was taken. When the island was finally declared secure in March 1945, the numbers told a story the photograph never could. Nearly 7,000 Americans killed, over 19,000 wounded. Out of roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, almost none survived. It was one of the few Pacific battles where total American casualties exceeded the number of Japanese taken alive. The victory was undeniable, but it was not clean. The image of the flag raising spread across newspapers within days. It became a symbol of resilience and unity. 3 of the 6 Marines in the photograph would not survive the battle. The image was used in war bond drives. It was sculpted into bronze. It was turned into a national icon. Meanwhile, the men still fighting in the northern ridges were clearing bunkers with flamethrowers and demolition charges. The public saw triumph. The Marines experienced attrition. The island itself became an airbase almost immediately. Damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids over Japan began landing on Iwo Jima in emergency situations. Over the coming months, thousands of airmen would owe their survival to that captured strip of volcanic rock. Strategically, the battle had purpose. But strategically necessary does not mean emotionally simple. Letters home did not describe the tunnels. Newsreels did not linger on the weeks of close-quarter fighting after Suribachi fell. The narrative compressed the battle into a moment, a flag against the sky. But the cost lingered long after the cameras moved on. Families received telegrams. Units were rebuilt. The Marine Corps absorbed one of the bloodiest engagements in its history and continued forward toward Okinawa. Iwo Jima became proof of resolve. It also became a preview. Because if a small island could demand this much blood, what would the invasion of Japan itself require? That question was already forming in the minds of planners, and the answer was not encouraging. By the time Iwo Jima was secure, American planners were already studying the numbers. They saw the casualties. They saw the resistance. They saw how a small, isolated island cut off from reinforcement, bombarded for months, surrounded by overwhelming naval power, had still required weeks of brutal, inch-by-inch fighting. And they asked a quiet question. If this is what one island costs, what will Japan cost? The battle shattered illusions about a quick collapse of Japanese resistance. On Iwo Jima, the defenders did not launch reckless charges. They did not waste men in suicidal banzai attacks. They adapted. They buried themselves. They turned the island into a fortress beneath the surface. That lesson would echo months later on Okinawa. It would echo in projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. American casualty estimates for that invasion ranged into the hundreds of thousands. Iwo Jima became a case study, not in easy victory, but in the price of forcing surrender. Strategically, the island proved valuable. More than 2,000 B-29 bombers would eventually make emergency landings there. Thousands of American airmen survived because that airstrip existed. But survival statistics do not erase the ground truth. Every yard of that airfield was paid for in blood. And the famous photograph? It became a symbol of unity in a war-weary nation. It helped sell war bonds. It lifted morale. It told Americans that sacrifice had meaning, but symbols simplify. Reality complicates. The men who climbed Mount Suribachi were not thinking about monuments. They were thinking about staying alive long enough to see another sunrise. 3 of them would not. The flag became immortal. They did not. Iwo Jima stands as a paradox, a tactical necessity, a strategic warning, a moral weight. It proved American resolve. It exposed Japanese determination. And it forced leaders to confront a truth they could no longer ignore. Ending the war would require something extraordinary. 5 months later, atomic bombs would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan would surrender. The invasion of the home islands would never happen. Many historians argue that the casualty projections shaped that decision. Iwo Jima was part of that calculation, not just as territory, but as evidence. Evidence of how fiercely Japan would fight. In the end, victory was achieved. The flag was raised. The island was taken. But beneath the bronze statues and black and white photographs lies a harder memory. Weeks of smoke, Miles of tunnels. Young men advancing over volcanic ash toward enemies they could not see. War is often remembered in moments, but it is lived in days. And on Iwo Jima, those days were long, brutal, and unforgettable. Victory was claimed, but the cost was written in the names of those who never came home.